Alrighty, howdy. All right, so 6 was kind of long. So probably the longest section we've had so far. So, um, I'm not sure how to begin with this. So why don't we start just with what you guys thought, and then maybe questions you had if you had questions. Since this is a longer one, I'm not exactly sure just yet. I'll need a few minutes to figure out how to go about this. But were there anything like things you noticed or questions you had about specific things? Since as I keep saying, this was a pretty long section, and she does a lot here. I mean, she's always doing a lot, right? But there's a lot going on here. So what have we been talking about up to this point in either section 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5?
I think you could go over how she talks about behaviors.
Yeah. So you guys may have noticed the subtitles for the different sections are usually informative, right? So section 1 is titled Vita Activa and the Human Condition, right? And in that section, amongst the other things we do, we just start talking about how she defines Vita Activa and what that has to do with the various conditions that make that type of life possible, right? Section 2 is called the term Vita Activa, talks about the history of the term as it came down to us from the Greeks. 3, eternity versus immortality. She's introducing us to that main dichotomy as a way of understanding one of the big differences between Greek ideas about immortality and the subsequent ideas about eternity. And now we're in chapter 2, right? We were talking about the public and the private realm. Section 4 is about what happens, or historically, what happened when we substituted the idea of the social for the political. And 5 sort of traces where this distinction really comes from the difference between living like life in the polis amongst your peers and your equals, and in the household when you're everything's strictly unequal because one person's in charge, right? So now this section that we just read for today is called The Rise of the Social. So we've been introduced to the difference between some of the differences between the political and the private, or the private and the public, right? But so let's just do it this way, right? So there's the private, or the house, which began in the household. And what can we say about life in the household? What's it like? Is there equality? Not from the way she's talking about it, right? Not in an ancient Greek household, there's not. So inequality, and the reason why there's inequality is because there's rulership, right? So one person rules, and as a result, from the Greek mindset, that means there's inequality, right? There's also necessity, because that's where the needs are met. So the house is where the labor is done, wherever all of that happens, right? And only by being able to leave the household, which requires, of course, as an attitude, courage. It requires some other things, right? Like in the ancient world, being a man who had a household. But if this stuff is taken care of, then you have the ability to leave the private. Because remember that what part of the point is that the private and the public, right? So you might have noticed this in the book, but our word private really, well, actually, let's just do that, right? What do you guys think of when you think of the word privacy? And what comes to mind, or what does privacy mean to you guys? Just for you, not the book or anything, just.
I would say like by myself.
Being by yourself, okay. So that's a good question of solitude is an interesting one, right? So being by yourself might be is one way of looking at privacy. And that's, yeah, we'll see that contrast will come up again. So being by yourself or being alone is one way of looking at privacy. Trying to think if there are ways of being alone which don't require that you be private, but I don't know. What else you guys think?
You can be alone in your thoughts.
Yeah. So thought is a really interesting one too. So there's the whole fact that whatever is going on in our head is only available to us usually, right? Right. So I think she mentioned this priv part of private. Literally we call it privative, right? But it means more like think of the word deprive, right? Deprive part is the same part as private, right? So even though like nowadays, my guess is that a lot of us might think of our privacy as something, of course, on one hand that we want to protect, right? We probably also think about it as maybe the primary location for a lot of our activities, right? A lot of the stuff you do at your house, in your room, right? Maybe even like in your bed from your laptop, right? Or from your phone, or something like that. And so as a result, when we think of privacy, at least whenever I think of privacy, I'm inclined to think of my personal life, right? I'm a private citizen. I just living my normal life and I'm not a very public person. I mean, of course, I teach that's not quite the same thing. So from the ancient mindset, the private was not really fully real, right? Remember we talked about how only people who are able to transcend their condition and to create great works and deeds and words that are worthy of immortality are really fully human in an authentic way. And so from the ancient mindset, the ancient Greek mindset, privacy is going to be, even though it's important and literally necessary, it's not going to be where people literally shine, right? If you're going to shine, what do you need? An audience, right? If you're going to shine, you need an audience. So part of leaving the private, being able to leave the private for the public, is coming into a sphere where now there is equality because you're amongst your peers, which in this case just means that you're amongst other free people. It doesn't mean that you are completely equal in all ways. And rather than being bound by necessity, you have freedom. And freedom, which is always freedom from something, in this case, necessity, is the freedom of, well, we see this is where the world is, right? This is where the self, the house, this is where the outside kind of public world is. There's freedom, there's world, and let me see. Right, we have an audience. And right, public, private. Now there's this third thing, which we're now talking about, which is the social, right? And because there's freedom by definition and because there's plurality, we're in the public, that's where action happens, right? It's very hard to overstate, like for Arendt, the public is where action happens, right? Political action, and in the sense of numerous people coming together and organizing themselves. Now there's the social, this thing which kind of began to rise in the 18th and 19th century. And what are some of, like Mia brought up, it's Mia, right? Brought up the whole rules and behavior thing. So what is, how and where does the social fit in terms of this stuff, based on what you've read so far? Is the social more like the public or the private? Okay, why might we say it's more like the private?
I think she said that there is like no real action.
Yeah, so she definitely says it's decisive that society, this is on page 40, and on all of its levels excludes the possibility of action, which formerly was excluded from the household. So she definitely thinks that for some reason action doesn't occur in the social the same way it wasn't possible to occur in the private. That's one thing. Do you want to go a little deeper on that, or do we want to keep listing stuff? Oh, okay. Okay, so in one way, we might say the social is like the private, at least according to Arendt. But if you're just thinking about your own social life, which I assume all of you have, it would be really tragic if you were undergrads and didn't have one. Is your social life more like the private or the public in your experience? Okay, and why you say public?
And when I think social, I just think of like more people, like peers and interactions with others.
Yeah, so it's definitely like, it seems like the public in that a lot of the times I still have to leave my house and I'm going to go hang out with people, and there's more than one of them, right? So I could like, so there's, if we're not thinking just in terms of action, it seems at least like the social is more like public, right? Don't you, in fact, if we wanted to be like funny about this, don't you socialize in public? Like that's a thing you can do, right? So maybe the social is a bit more like the public. So remember though, that what Arendt says about, brings up about the social, or about even about the household, is that there's these words she uses like natural togetherness, right? Or natural community. I don't remember if she ever uses the word, oh yeah, natural association. So remember that being together, like the fact that as the fact that when we do hang out with others and whenever we are socializing, that there's more than one of us. The fact that there's more than one of us, first of all, is just a fact, like it's one of the conditions under which we experience life. There's always been more than one of us, right? At the same time, that togetherness, being together with others, is a need, right? Where's part of the point of saying that we're social animals or social creatures is to say that we're the kinds of creatures that need others, right? So there's still an element of togetherness in which, even though it's true that plurality is the condition under which we experience the the possibility for things like action, simply being together is not necessarily automatically going to be political. It still, in many cases, just meets our needs, right? Because again, you don't choose which family you're born into. You don't, even for most of your life, choose your social circles at all, right? I mean, if you think about it, I don't know if any of you ever thought about this. I thought about it. It stressed me out sometimes. Growing up in school, I would think things kind of like, I'm friends with all my friends just because I happened to go to this school. And we were all in the same class, and we spent every day, 5 days a week for however many years together, especially back in elementary school when you just have one class, right? And I would always wonder things like, how would my friends have been different if I went to a different school? Anyone ever have any of those moments, kind of like, what if? And then you wonder, what if I went to UT Austin, right? I'm sure none of us have those thoughts. But the natural togetherness, the whole fact that humans do this group thing is not necessarily a public thing. It's very much like Anna Arendt's arguing and trying to get us to see that in a lot of ways, that whole togetherness element is a lot like the household, right? Because, well, yeah, we can talk about, now, is there equality or inequality in society or in the social, the way Arendt's talking about it? She definitely thinks there's a kind of equality, but it's not the equality, the same equality of the old public, right? It's a different kind of equality. The kind of equality that the social has is the quality of conforming, right? So she brought up, or early in the chapter, and you may have never heard of this person, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right? And Rousseau was interesting because it was a lot of things, really. During that time, smart people were really smart and so often did a whole bunch of things. But he was a philosopher, and he's known on one hand for coming up with the idea of, or articulating the idea of what we call the social contract, right? Just for, in case you ever wanted to use a bit of light reading, right? But he also really was kind of down on society. He thought that society was really just primarily a corrupting influence. You start off as a wonderful, innocent little baby, and then you make the wrong friends at school, and then we're screwed for the rest of your life, right? So he had the idea of Rousseau, beyond the social contract and the sort of revolting against society, is there's also this relationship between the private and to some extent the intimate, right? The intimate, Arendt implies, is for us now kind of what the private shelters, right? So in the past, the idea of the private sphere of the household was kind of, as she says, shadowy, because, you know, other than archaeology, it's not like a lot of people didn't keep diaries or anything. So what goes on in the house and what went on in people's everyday life in sort of ancient times, in a lot of ways, is kind of mysterious, because it was just very different from the way we think of it. But nowadays, when we think of privacy, you probably think of all of the sort of intimate stuff you do, either when you're by yourself or with people who are close enough to you to be, like, basically be in your life, right? Like your roommates, your family, those kinds of people. Again, here's another, I guess, thing you might think about. Do any of you, like, even when you're at home alone, still close the door when you go to the bathroom? I mean, if you think about it, yeah, sometimes you're like, why do I do this? But I'm definitely one of those people. Even if I was in a house alone, like, it'd still be like weird to like not close the door when you go to the bathroom. And part of that is because we've been trained from a very, very young age, the youngest conceivable age, you know, diapers and potty training, that stuff is private, right? And the reason why, for some reason, we have to call your genitals your privates is because they're so private, we can't talk about them. Right? And all of those things, like, and again, you can take that as also as a model, right? A lot of the things that are involved in privacy and intimacy derive from the fact that you have a body, right? And because most of us would prefer to keep our bodily processes private, right? And that's not, I mean, there's no judgment there. It's just, that's how we are, right? That stuff is private. So, but all of that was to say that the private is now kind of the shelter for the intimate. And at the same time, right, so Rousseau discovers the intimate, and other people realize that the private's not necessarily actually the foil of the public, although that is historically where the dichotomy was. The private in a lot of ways is actually the opposite of the social, right? Because you have your private intimacy, and then you have Twitter, right? Where everything's out there and where everybody's looking at you. So that's where we come to this idea of the conformity, right? So instead of action, the kind of activity that the private life demands labor or is involved in labor, and our other sort of feeding the life process, right? Somehow work plays into this. There's both work probably in the public and in the private, but action is in the sphere of the public and the political. Instead of action, though, so this kind of activity which society demands is behavior, right? And again, if that sounds sort of weird to say, in other words, what society demands of us is that we, or really you, behave, right? How does society make you behave? Does anyone not walk on the seal? Why don't we walk on the seal?
Like social.
What are the social repercussions? They'll look down on you. Will they really look down on you? Have you ever conscientiously looked down on someone for walking on the seal? This is genuine questions, people. Like, I do not know. Right now we're talking about behavior and how society makes us behave as a sort of difference between the public and the private. So yeah. Is it that big of a deal if you walk on the seal? I mean, if you're willing to be here an extra year, right? But so yeah, one of it, at least we call that one a superstition, right? Or at least it can, or if we like it enough, a tradition, right? But it's not all superstition, right? That's just one example. How else does society, or let's make sure we understand this, right? It's not necessarily in the case of the superstition of the seal that when someone walks over it, everyone literally stops and gasps. Although I have heard people screaming at people not to walk under the century tree. So that one may be a little bit more high stakes, because that one's not just graduation. I guess it's who you spend your life with. But all of those are sort of cute and stuff. But have you ever noticed, or at least maybe I'm just confessing here, I'll just confess. When it comes down to not walking on the seal or walking under the century tree, the real reason why I don't do it is not because I fear repercussions from some squadron of like core people who are going to come and punish me for doing it. It's because the thought of doing it and the sensation of being about to do it makes me incredibly uncomfortable. Does anyone wear their hat in the MSc? Why? Of course, I'm aware that it's not allowed, but what does it mean that it's not allowed? Does someone jump you if you walk in with a hat on? Usually.
No, I've seen somebody like get walked up to like immediately.
It's an interesting, so actually one of the professors in the anthropology department used to do research on this, and they would literally like try to find like who actually enforces the rule. And it turns out in a lot of these traditions that it's really only a very vocal, very aggressive minority that actually ever does that. But of course you could wind up being in the presence of one of those, maroon bleeding people who's, gonna be unpleasant if you do that. But I've also seen it to where people just walk through and nothing really happens. Because there's too less time for that. Like to stop and like accost someone on behalf of a tradition, you have to really, really take it seriously. And although of course we respect the fallen and the MSC is a memorial, most people are busy getting their Panda or their Chick-fil-A rather than worrying about the fallen, right? So the real reason, again, in my case, why I wouldn't wear a hat in the MSC is because the moment I walked in with a hat on, and I know that I'm not supposed to walk in with a hat on, I would feel uncomfortable, right? That might sound like an exaggeration, like perhaps you guys can't resonate, but have you never done anything simply because doing otherwise would make you uncomfortable? Uncomfortable enough to not want to have to deal with it? I should have that really difficult conversation with my parents. Or not. We could just avoid it and stanch it and let it, let the whole deathbed scene play out, right? Or I should probably say that thing to that other person who really needs to hear this, or not, because it would make me really uncomfortable. So much of what we do doesn't have to be enforced by anybody. It's enforced by ourselves. And why do we enforce it? Because the alternative gives us the heebie-jeebies. And the heebie-jeebies are nothing to sneeze at. So the relevant thing here is that behavior is what society substitutes for action, which is going to imply, at least in Arendt's opinion and in the part of the point of this analysis, is that the reason why society turns out to be more like the private, even though it takes place in this weird kind of public or quasi-public environment, is because, and Arendt says this a lot, it may be helpful at some point to actually go through and to list out all the times that she says this. But in various points, she says things like at the beginning of 6, this is page 38. The emergence of society, the rise of housekeeping, its activities, problems, and organizational devices, from the shadowy interior of the household into the light of the public sphere, has not only blurred the old borderline between private and political, it has also changed, almost beyond recognition, the meaning of the two terms and their significance for the life of the individual and the citizen. So the idea of society as the rise of housekeeping, right? Right. So remember also that the household is, the economy is the word for housekeeping, right? And she's going to point out that the rise of the social corresponds to this idea that rises out of the 18th and 19th century, that something very strange started happening in the what we now call the modern period. For instance, due to increasing technology like the printing press and stuff like that, it became possible for the first time to wake up and be reading a newspaper in which you were reading about the same events as people who live off a few cities down, right? So for the first time ever, you realize or you come to understand when things like natural disasters happen, right? In the 1700s, for instance, there was a big earthquake in Portugal, one of the worst sort of earthquakes in European history, and killed a lot of people. And that was one of the first things that was widely disseminated, for instance, in newspapers. And on top of that, you have this revival of interest in local traditions and kind of your people's ethnic background. Like you have like a lot of the Brothers Grimm, right? Like they collected fairy tales. And part of the point of collecting fairy tales wasn't just because that was interesting, although it was. The interest in the study of, for instance, folklore, folk, in case you do not know, in German means people. So folklore, the lore of the people, is just all of that traditional stuff, right? But the purpose for looking into that stuff was because the Brothers Grimm wanted, in part, to better understand the German language and the German people. Same thing for lots of different people at that time who were doing this kind of stuff. So society, the idea that we're all part of the same society is kind of the new idea, right, from the modern period. There was, of course, like for instance, you may have wondered, why was it that the Greeks, even though they were cool and all that, they never actually founded countries, right? It was always cities. There's Athens, Sparta. It wasn't until like much later down the line when it was like, you know what, we're all Greek. And it's weird because the Greeks all spoke, you know, a mutually intelligible language and they had the same religion, but it never occurred to them that they were all part of the same society. The Romans, I mean, the Greeks still went to war with the Trojans, the Spartans still went to war with the Athenians. They didn't have this idea of all being part of the same group. But as the idea of the nation state rose, and what after all is a nation, this is edgy. What is a nation, by the way? We call the idea of the current state model the nation state, right? So there's Spain, Germany, France, all that. But that's the state part of it. That's what happens when you make a nation into a state. What actually is a nation? Yeah, so it's definitely a group of people. Is it going to be more? I mean, this might be too leading of a question. Is it possible? Let's just put the fuses together. That the nat in natural, and the nat in nation, and the nat in nativity, in other words, birth, are the same thing, or point to the same direction. A nation's a people. In Greek, it's an ethnos. Right. And an ethos, by the way, is the behavior of an ethnos. So an ethos is how people act, how they behave. But a nation is a people, which means that in this idea, this idea of the nation, which rose in European consciousness in the 18th and 19th century, is the idea that we're all part of the same family, right? Now, the US is always going to be an interesting and important exception to this because we are a nation state built enormously upon immigration, right? In which from the very beginning, there's always been different ethnic groups together. And that's also partially why it's been difficult for the US to kind of coalesce around this idea that we're all part of the same family. Because in a lot of ways, especially when you give our incredibly racialized and racist history, in our experience, it's largely not. But Europe has this interesting situation, as do a lot of the other, probably most of the other nations on Earth, in that it's incredibly cosmopolitan, but you do have these distinct people groups, right? And the idea, the rise of the nation state is the idea that we're all part of the same people group. We're Spaniards, we're Englishmen, we're Irish, that kind of thing, right? It's also why, because we have that sore spot as Americans, so many of us are so pathetically obsessed with where we come from, right? Because it's not obvious where we come from all the time. And whenever it's not obvious, it makes you wonder, who are my people? Usually, historically, the people who more or less look like you, who come from the same ethnicity, who speak the same language. And at the rise in the 19th century, it was the thought arose, which is, oh, cool, let's institutionalize that. But that means that we begin administrating society as though it was one big household. And so now the thing we have to do is political economy, right? So the thing that started off as home economics, literally, just the meeting the needs, balancing the checkbook, all of that, becomes this big scale project in which now all of society is like a household, or all of our people group is like a household, and we have to meet the people's needs. And that means that now the biggest task, our biggest task is our sort of national economy, right? And whose job is it to run this national economy?
The same people.
Yeah, I mean, so it's definitely the people, there's always going to be people from here on out, right? But it's going to be the government. So remember, interestingly, that the idea of rulership started in the household, right? When you blow that up to the size of an entire society or an entire nation, now the job of your leaders becomes primarily government, which becomes, or like, the board's getting messy, let me clear some space, right? And the task, again, of, so you go from a household management system, economy, and you blow that up to the size of a nation, and so you get national economy or political economy. And now it's the job of the government to take care of all that. But do you need, as society gets bigger and bigger, is it gonna be like in the old household where just one person's in charge of everything? Possibly sometimes, but do you need one person to run all of this? Could one person run the United States economy? Definitely not. So instead of just government, which is still modeled on the old idea of, okay, we have a king who's like dad, and now you have the task of government primarily just becomes administration. So the idea is that the rise of society, whatever that means, on one hand, for our actual social lives, we probably look at it and think of it very differently. But from the political side of things, the rise of the social corresponds to the rise of this idea that nations are big families that have to be taken care of by a government whose main job is the administration of the national economy, because now the number one job of the government is making sure that everyone's needs are met, right? And chances are, we just take that for granted as the way that it should be. And I'm not even saying that it shouldn't be that way. It's just like, but that is very much one of the things that in our experience, we take for granted. And from the ancient perspective looking forward, would have been absolutely bizarre. Because, and here's also why this becomes a thing, right? So when the Roman emperors, and this didn't all happen at once, and there's some precedence for it in ancient society. But when the Romans started off with a republic, right? And then moved to an emperor. And remember that the emperor adopted the title of Dominus, right? Lord. But what is Dominus synonymous with? I think we talked about this last time. Who was originally the Dominus? Yeah, the pater familias, right? So when the emperor, just to think, if the Romans are a bit too remote, you can think in terms of Star Wars, right? When the emperor declared himself the Dominus, the pater familias, it's literally like he's saying, who's your daddy? Right? And that's when the Romans are like, oh, we're not free anymore. Because being under the government of an enormous social father who now rules everything to take care of the family's needs means that we're not amongst our peers anymore. And so we literally, in political terms, don't have freedom. Because now we are subject to a regime of national housekeeping. And dad and mom can send you to your room. It's hardly called sending you to prison, right? Or things like that. It's not a one-to-one ratio, but that's very much the thrust of where this is going. Now, however, even though we don't, according to this analysis, experience political freedom anymore, as long as we're under the domination of someone like a monarch or an emperor, nowadays in society, most of our freedoms aren't terribly political anyway. So what we did, socially speaking, was move a lot of our kinds of freedom, the kinds that we cared about, to the realm of the social. Right? So now this is where we experience a lot of what we think of as freedom, at least what we think of as freedom. Now remember that freedom back then, back for the Greeks who had this political idea, it was primarily about one, the equality of being amongst peers who are not subject to necessity, and I guess this is another important point, right? I brought up that you need an audience if you want to shine, right? And for the Greeks, shining was quite literally was another way of talking about that immortality, right? Really making it, like Hercules having his moment, from the Disney movie, right? But in order to shine, you need an audience, you need a public, which means that in the Greek mindset, the political sphere is where you shine most truly, right? Because the public, which is always also an audience, is the audience before which you show who you truly are, through your words, through your deeds, and through your actions. Specifically actions in the old sense, right? Not just what you do. So which is why, again, from the ancient mindset, if you just stayed in the private, you could never be fully human because you could never show who you truly are. For the Greeks, every one of us in some way, in some sense, now not every one of us, obviously they had their baggage, but if we transpose the Greek mindset to today, each one of us is locked up inside of ourselves. And we don't become fully who we are until we literally come out of ourselves and show ourselves to the world and what we've got. And for the Greeks, that could only happen within the realm of politics, which is why it's most important from a young age to get good at speaking and to go into politics, right? Most of us are probably not currently involved in that activity, even if we're otherwise politically active, which for us might mean, if we're lucky, voting sometimes. Now, however, a lot of our freedoms, the place where a lot of us try to shine is in the social. When you want to let the world know who you are, do you run for office or do you put it on Insta? I put it on Insta, right? I've never run for office at all. And so it sort of represents a shift in which now the sphere in which a lot of us try to put ourselves out there is a realm in which it's not strictly public, like in the sense of political. It may be public in the sense of being out there, like not in the house. But nowadays, most of us derive our exercise of our freedom and achieve our kind of self-expression. We could just ask that, right? Where does self-expression happen? Isn't it the case that nowadays we assume that nobody in politics is real? If we see someone, we're like, oh, a politician. And then all we need to do is ask which side they're on. And then we feel we know all we need to know about them. From the Greek mindset, that would be absurd because everyone, if they were going to be a politician, had to be really competitive and individual, right? And nowadays, but the fact that we now look at politics and we see, oh yeah, that's all the same thing, shows the extent to which we think you don't really become who you really are in politics. You just become smart and manipulative enough to further some ideology, right? And the people who we really melt over are, you know, the artists, the musicians, the Instagram models, the TikTokers, right? That is where people try to make their mark and wherever they brand themselves and try to sort of become who they are. And that's just how we experience it as different, right? So the point of this longer section was that having introduced the distinction between the private and the public, we can see how this new thing arose relatively recently in our history called society, which has a lot of the characteristics of both the public and the private, but which is far more like the private in that one, it's based upon this idea of household management. And you'll find, we don't like, this was all meant to build up to answering Mia's question like 30 minutes ago. But the point is that when you have a large enough society, things begin to be enforced not by law necessarily, but by conformism. And by the fact that when large groups of people get together, for some reason, just because of the kinds of creatures we all start acting the same. And then all you need is to set up a system where people feel weird and uncomfortable acting different. And then they probably won't, almost ever. And that'll map largely onto certain features about the society that you're living in. But the point is that the idea is that in society, as social creatures who are just merely together, because human animals need to be together, under that aspect, as social animals, humans are not really acting. And a lot of the so-called behavioral sciences, like economics, anthropology, psychology, all assume, this is a foundational assumption of behavioral science, that humans don't act freely or independently, that we're just these bundles of behavior and activity that follow predictable patterns. And if we could just learn the patterns, we could socially engineer society. And it would be great, right? Right? I mean, that's what psychology is all about, right? Most people think psychology is the study of the mind. We gave that up a long time ago. Psychology is the statistical study of human behavior. And if it doesn't manifest in behavior that you can test by getting a bunch of undergrads to do online surveys for extra credit, it's not real. So one of the big underlying assumptions of modern society is that humans don't do great acts or words or deeds. We just behave. If we're good, and if not, we're abnormal. And we have to be treated because we're sick. But that's all we have time for. See you guys Monday.